I was a ghost in a city of millions, a girl who didn't exist to anyone until touched the one person I was never supposed to see. I thought I was saving a lost boy from the rain. I didn't realize I was holding a live wire that could burn the entire city down. The rain in this city doesn't just fall, it punishes. It washes away the fingerprints of people like me, the ones who sleep in the spaces the world forgot. My name is Xylia, and to the thousands of people rushing home to their warm beds, I'm just a smudge of grime against the concrete. I've learned to be a shadow. I move through the neon-lit streets of the district, my oversized hoodie acting as armor, my eyes always on the ground looking for what others discard. But tonight, the rhythmic drum of the downpour was broken by a sound that didn't belong in an alleyway. It wasn't the scuttle of a rat or the groan of a rusted gate. It was a sob, small, rhythmic, and terrifyingly human. That's when I saw him. He was tucked behind a mountain of damp cardboard, his skin a pale moon against the dark brick. His clothes were silk, tailored, and worth more than my life, but they were torn and smeared with the filth of the gutter. He looked at me, and for the first time in 3 years, someone actually saw me. I reached out my hand, intending only to offer a dry corner of my basement squat. I didn't see the black SUVs circling the block like sharks. I didn't know that by closing my fingers around his, I was declaring war on the most powerful man in the country. I didn't choose the shadows, they chose me. In a city that vibrates with the neon pulse of progress, there is a specific kind of silence reserved for people the world has decided to forget. I am Xylia, and my life is a masterclass in the art of being unnoticeable. I don't walk down the sidewalk, I drift along the edges of it, blending into the soot-stained brick and the rhythmic hiss of steam vents. To the businessman checking his gold watch, I am no different than a discarded flyer, a piece of the background that his eyes skip over to find something with more value. Survival is a game of math and timing. I know which bakery throws out the day-old sourdough at precisely 10:15 p.m., and I know which subway grades provide enough heat to keep your blood from sluggishly freezing during the January lows. My home is a crawlspace beneath a condemned laundromat, a sanctuary of damp concrete and stolen blankets where the smell of industrial detergent still clings to the walls, masking the scent of desperation. It's a lonely existence, but loneliness is safe. Loneliness doesn't ask for your ID or wonder why a 16-year-old girl isn't in a classroom. But lately, the air in the district has changed. It's heavier, charged with a static I can't explain. For the past 3 nights, I felt a different kind of shadow following mine, not the indifferent gaze of the law, but something colder. Something patient. I've seen the same sleek, window-tinted vehicles idling near the soup kitchens, their engines humming with a predatory stillness that sends a shiver down my spine. They aren't looking for vagrants to move along, they are searching for something specific. Something they lost. I told myself to stay hidden. I told myself that curiosity is a luxury for people with full stomachs. But as I crouched in the mouth of that alley tonight, watching the rain turn the street into a blurred mirror of oil and light, I realized the invisibility I had perfected was about to become my greatest weapon, or my tombstone. Because when I reached for that boy, I felt a tremor in his small hand that told me he wasn't just cold. He was terrified of the very people the world thinks are the heroes. As I pulled him deeper into the darkness of my world, a searchlight from a passing cruiser cut through the rain, illuminating a black SUV parked just 20 feet away. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He didn't look like a cop. He looked like an executioner in a $3,000 suit, and he was holding a photo that looked exactly like the boy trembling against my side. The man in the suit didn't call out. He didn't shout for the boy. He simply stood there, the rain sheeting off the brim of his black fedora, scanning the alley with a clinical, predatory focus. In his hand, the photograph fluttered, a small, glossy square of a world where Juan smiled and wore clean clothes. To that man, I wasn't even a person, I was just part of the trash heap he was currently dissecting with his eyes. Juan's grip on my hand tightened until his knuckles turned white. His breath hitched, a tiny, jagged sound that felt like a gunshot in the quiet of the rain. I pressed my palm over his mouth, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Don't breathe, I thought. Become the brick. Become the shadows. the man took a step forward. The heel of his polished shoe splashed into a puddle, the sound echoing off the narrow walls. He reached into his coat, and for a terrifying second, I expected the flash of a barrel. Instead, he pulled out a radio, his voice a low, melodic growl that cut through the downpour. "Sector 4 is clear. No sign of the asset." Asset. They didn't even call him a child. As he turned his back to adjust his earpiece, I saw my window, a narrow, rusted fire escape 3 feet to our left. It was a gamble. The metal would groan, it would protest. But staying here was a death sentence. I leaned into Juan's ear, my voice nothing more than a ghost of a whisper. "When I move, you move. Don't look back." We bolted. The first step was silent, but the second hit a loose metal plate. Clang. The sound ripped through the alley. The man spun around, his hand flying back to his holster with fluid, lethal grace. "Hey!" I didn't wait to see the rest. I shoved Juan toward the ladder and he scrambled up with a desperate, wiry strength I didn't know a 6-year-old possessed. I scrambled after him, my boots slipping on the wet rungs. Below us, the man reached the base of the ladder, his face tilted upward, a mask of cold, calculated fury. He wasn't alone anymore. 2 more sets of headlights swung into the alley, illuminating the falling rain like silver needles. We hit the first landing and I hauled Juan over the railing just as a gloved hand grabbed at my ankle. I kicked back blindly, feeling the satisfying thud of my heel connecting with something solid. A grunt of pain followed, but I didn't stay to celebrate. We sprinted across the slick rooftop, the wind whipping my head back. My lungs burned, and the invisible safety I had cultivated for years was shattered. I looked down at the street as we reached the ledge of the next building. The black SUVs were already peeling out, repositioning like a pack of wolves cutting off a deer. They knew where we were heading. But they didn't know the rooftops. They didn't know the secret paths of the girl who lived in the gaps. I looked at Juan, his eyes wide and shimmering with tears he refused to let fall. "Why are they hurting you?" I whispered, mostly to myself. Juan finally spoke, his voice small and trembling. "Because I'm the only one who saw what he did to my father." The rooftops were a labyrinth of rusted vents and crumbling chimneys, a skeletal world held together by iron and grit. Below us, the city hummed with a deceptive calm, but I could feel the invisible net tightening. Every time a headlight swept across a brick wall, my stomach dropped. Juan's hand was a small, cold weight in mine, a reminder that the stakes had shifted from my own survival to a responsibility I wasn't prepared for. "I saw what he did," Juan had said. Those words echoed in my head, louder than the rain. In the world of the invisible, information is more dangerous than a knife. I knew then that we couldn't go to the shelters, and we certainly couldn't go to the police. If the men in those SUVs were looking for an asset, the authorities were likely just another set of eyes in the boss's pocket. We crossed a narrow plank bridging 2 tenement buildings, the wood slick and groaning under our weight. I led him toward the industrial district, a graveyard of hollowed-out factories where the silence was thick enough to swallow a secret. My usual squat was compromised, they'd find the laundry map by morning if they tracked our trajectory. I needed somewhere deeper. Somewhere dead. "Are we going to sleep?" Juan asked, his voice cracking. He was shivering violently now, the shock of the chase finally catching up to his small frame. "Not yet," I murmured, scanning the horizon. "We have to disappear before the sun comes up. In this city, the light is your enemy." I guided him toward the old clock tower of an abandoned textile mill. The stairs were gone, replaced by a series of precarious maintenance ladders that only someone who had spent years scavenging would know. As we climbed, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, not the rhythmic pulse of an ambulance, but the sharp, aggressive chirps of a coordinated sweep. They were sealing the perimeter. We reached the high loft of the tower, a cavernous space filled with the smell of dry rot and ancient oil. I pushed aside a heavy canvas tarp to reveal a small, hidden nook behind the massive brass gears of the frozen clock. It was cramped and freezing, but from here, we could see the entire grid of the city through the cracks in the clock face. I sat Juan down on a pile of burlap sacks and wrapped my thin, damp jacket around his shoulders. As the first faint gray of dawn began to bleed into the sky, I looked out through the Roman numeral 4. Below, the black SUVs hadn't left. They had parked in a perfect triangular formation around the block, their engines still running, their headlights cutting through the fog like the eyes of a beast waiting for its prey to blink. Then, Juan leaned his head against my arm, his breathing finally leveling out into a fragile sleep. I realized with a jolt of terror that I wasn't just hiding a boy, I was guarding a witness. And as the city began to wake, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. One of the men from the SUV stepped out and began unfolding a drone. They weren't just searching the streets anymore. They were coming for the skyline. The silence of the clock tower was broken by a sound far worse than a siren, the ragged, wet cough of a child whose body had finally broken. Juan was no longer just shivering, he was burning. I pressed my palm to his forehead, and the heat radiating off his skin felt like a brand. His eyes were half open, glazed with a feverish sheen, looking past me at ghosts I couldn't see. "Father," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "It's too dark. I can't see the stars." Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I had survived fevers alone by curling into a ball and praying for morning, but Juan didn't have my calloused constitution. He was a creature of climate control and silk, now trapped in a tomb of damp brick. If I didn't get his fever down, he wouldn't make it to see the men in suits fail. I looked out through the V of the clock face. The sun was a pale, sickly yellow behind the smog, and the drones were humming. They sounded like giant hornets, darting between the skyscrapers with mechanical precision. Their high-definition lenses were searching for heat signatures, for movement, for us. "Stay here," I whispered, tucking the burlap tighter around him. "Don't make a sound. If you hear someone who isn't me, crawl into the gear shaft. Do you understand?" Juan didn't answer. He only gripped my sleeve for a second before his hand fell limp. I slipped out of the tower, moving with the desperate grace of a shadow. My target was a small, 24-hour clinic 3 blocks away that serviced the dockworkers. I couldn't use the rooftops now, the drones owned the sky. I had to go down into the belly of the beast. I moved through the alleyways, my heart stopping every time the whir of a drone intensified overhead. I reached the clinic's back entrance, a rusted steel door. I didn't have money, but I had a scavenger's kit, a tension wrench and a rake. My hands shook as I worked the tumbler. Click. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. I scrambled behind the counter, my eyes darting across labels I could barely read in the dim light. Acetaminophen. Antibiotics. I shoved them into my pockets, along with a bottle of water and a clean cloth. As I turned to leave, the front window of the clinic exploded. Glass rained down like diamonds as a black-clad figure stepped through the frame. But it wasn't a man in a suit. It was a woman, her hair pulled back into a lethal silver ponytail, a suppressed pistol held with terrifying steadiness. She didn't look at the drugs. She looked at the muddy footprint I'd left on the linoleum. "I know you're here, little ghost," she said, her voice smooth and cold as a razor. "The boss doesn't want the girl. Just give me the boy, and I'll let you go back to your shadows." I realized then that they weren't just tracking Juan. They were tracking me. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I stayed pressed against the cold metal of the medicine cabinet, the plastic bottles in my pocket clicking together like a countdown. The woman with the silver hair moved with a terrifying, rhythmic grace. She wasn't searching, she was hunting. She knew the psychology of a cornered animal. She didn't look behind the desks, she looked at the exits, waiting for the moment my nerves snapped and I made a run for it. "You're a scavenger, aren't you?" she mused, her boots crunching on the glass. "You think you're saving him. But you're just prolonging the inevitable. A boy like that can't survive in your world, and a girl like you won't survive in his." I looked at the back door. It was 20 feet away. Between me and the handle was a row of heavy plastic waiting chairs and an open floor plan that offered zero cover. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing past the fever medicine until they found a heavy glass bottle of industrial-strength cough syrup. I didn't throw it at her. I threw it at the fire alarm pull station across the room. The glass shattered against the red lever, and a split second later, the ceiling erupted. High-pressure sprinklers drenched the room in a blinding veil of water. The shrill, piercing scream of the alarm filled the clinic, a chaotic wall of sound that masked my footsteps. I bolted. I burst through the back door into the gray morning, my lungs screaming as I hit the pavement. I didn't go back toward the clock tower, not yet. I couldn't lead her to Juan. I had to lead her into the guts, a section of the slums where the buildings leaned so close together they choked out the sun, and the ground was a maze of open sewers and forgotten tunnels. I heard her behind me. She wasn't running, she was sprinting, her footsteps light and fast, closing the gap with terrifying efficiency. A bullet hissed past my ear, thudding into a wooden crate. She wasn't trying to kill me, she was hurting me. I veered into a narrow crawlspace beneath an old pier, the smell of salt and rot filling my nose. I knew this path. It led to a series of rusted drainage pipes that drained into the harbor. It was a dark, wet coffin for anyone who didn't know the tides. I slid into the muck, the freezing water soaking my jeans, and waited. Above me, the wooden planks of the pier groaned. The silver-haired woman stopped directly overhead. I could see the tip of her silencer poking through the gaps in the wood. "Smart girl," she whispered, her voice vibrating through the timber. "But even ghosts leave a trail of ripples." She began to pace, searching for the entry point. I looked at the medicine in my hand. Juan was fading, and I was trapped in a watery grave with a professional killer standing on my head. I had to make a choice, wait for her to find me, or use the only thing the Mafia didn't have. My invisibility. The water was rising, the icy tide of the harbor pressing against my chest. Above me, the woman's footsteps were deliberate, rhythmic, the sound of someone who had already won. She didn't know that this pier was a hollow shell, a graveyard of rotted timber and forgotten machinery. I reached out into the dark, my fingers finding the cold iron of a manual sluice gate lever. This was the guts of the district's old drainage system. I knew if I pulled it, the pressurized runoff from the morning's rain would surge through the pipes, but it would also flood the crawlspace I was currently standing in. "I see your shadow, Xylia," the woman called out, her voice dangerously close to the edge of the boards. "Give me the boy, and I'll make sure you get a warm bed tonight. A permanent one." I didn't answer. I took a deep breath, submerged myself in the murky water, and threw my entire weight onto the lever. The sound was a dull, subterranean roar. A wall of water and debris exploded from the secondary pipe behind the pier, buckling the rotted support beams. The wood groaned and snapped like dry toothpicks. I watched through the gaps as the woman lost her footing, her lethal composure breaking for a split second as the entire section of the pier she was standing on collapsed into the churning, muddy tide. She hit the water with a heavy splash, her silver ponytail swirling like a lure. I scrambled out from under the wreckage, gasping for air, and watched her claw her way onto a floating piece of timber. Her suppressed pistol was gone, swallowed by the silt. I stood on the bank, dripping and shivering, clutching the medicine bottles like a trophy. She looked up at me, coughing out salt water, but she wasn't reaching for a backup weapon. She was laughing, a jagged, bitter sound. "You think you're the hero?" she panted, wiping blood from a gash on her forehead. "You think you're saving him from the big, bad mafia boss?" "I'm saving him from people like you," I spat. "I wasn't sent by Quan Ho," she rasped, her eyes burning with a sudden, sharp pity. "The boss has been tearing the city apart looking for his son to protect him. I was sent by his second-in-command. The man who actually staged the kidnapping. The man who's currently standing right next to the boss, consoling him." The world tilted. The men in suits weren't a monolith. They were a civil war. "If you take that boy back to the estate now," she continued, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "you aren't returning him to his father. You're delivering him to his executioner. And the second knows exactly where your clock tower is." A drone buzzed overhead, circling low. It wasn't searching anymore. It was hovering, stationary, directly over the textile mill. I didn't wait for her to finish. I sprinted, the salt water burning my eyes and the weight of the medicine bottles thumping against my ribs like a second heartbeat. The assassin's words were a poison more potent than the fever. Juan wasn't being hunted by his father, but by the shadow standing behind the throne. As I rounded the corner of the industrial district, the textile mill came into view. My heart stopped. The triangular formation of SUVs was gone. In its place was a literal blockade. Half a dozen black sedans were angled toward the clock tower, their high beams washing the crumbling brick in a blinding, artificial noon. Men in tactical gear moved with surgical precision, setting up a perimeter. They weren't hiding anymore. They were preparing for a breach. I looked up. The drone I had seen earlier was now joined by two others. They hovered like vultures over the V and 7 of the clock face. They knew exactly where he was. Juan, I whispered, the name catching in my throat. If I tried to sneak back in, they'd catch me before I hit the first ladder. If I stayed out here, Juan would either die of the fever or be found by a traitor who would make sure the boy never spoke again. The invisibility that had kept me alive for 16 years was useless now. To save the boy, I had to become the most visible person in the city. I looked at the medicine in my hand, then at the line of armed men. My knees shook, and every instinct I had developed as a scavenger screamed at me to turn around and vanish into the shadows. I could survive. I always survived. But then I remembered the way Juan had gripped my sleeve. He didn't see a homeless girl, he saw a lifeline. I stepped out of the alleyway and into the glare of the headlights. I held my hands high above my head, the plastic medicine bottles clattering in my grip. Stop. I screamed, my voice cracking but carrying through the rain. I have the boy. But if you touch me, he dies. The clicking of safeties being disengaged echoed like a chorus of insects. A dozen red laser dots blossomed across my chest, centering on my heart. From the center SUV, the back door opened. A man stepped out. He was older, his face a map of iron-willed authority and grief, wearing a coat that cost more than the entire block. This was Mr. Kwanho. And standing inches behind him, holding an umbrella over the boss's head with a look of feigned concern, was a man with a scarred lip, the second in command. The traitor. He looked at me, and for a split second, his mask slipped. It was a look of pure, murderous frustration. He realized I wasn't just a witness, I was a variable he hadn't accounted for. "Where's my son?" Kwanho's voice was a low vibration that seemed to shake the pavement. I looked directly past the boss, straight into the eyes of the man with the umbrella. "He's safe. But I'm not giving him to you," I said, my voice gaining a sudden, cold edge. "I'm only giving him to his father. And I need to tell the boss exactly who put Juan in that gutter." The air between us was thick with the smell of wet asphalt and impending violence. The red laser dots danced on my skin, a dozen tiny reminders of how easily I could be erased. But I didn't look at the guns. I kept my gaze locked on Mr. Kwanho, the man who held the city in his fist, and the shadow standing just behind him. "You are bold, little ghost," Kwanho said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silk-wrapped growl. "Or perhaps just foolish. You stand in a sea of wolves and tell the alpha you don't trust his pack." "I don't trust the snake in the grass," I countered, my voice steady despite the tremor in my knees. I pointed a trembling finger at the second in command. "The man holding your umbrella? He's the reason your son was shivering behind a mountain of trash. He's the reason Juan is burning with a fever right now." A heavy silence fell. The second in command, a man named Minjae, didn't flinch. He let out a soft, pitying chuckle that made my skin crawl. "Sir, she's a street rat. She's likely delirious from hunger or trying to extort us. We should secure the boy before she does him more harm." Minjae stepped forward, his eyes flashing with a silent, lethal promise. He reached for me, his hand outstretched as if to guide a lost lamb, but I saw the way his fingers twitched, the reflex of a man used to snapping necks. "Don't touch me," I snapped, backing away toward the tower's entrance. Mr. Kwan-ho, if he was your loyal servant, why did his assassin try to drown me 3 blocks away? Why did she tell me that returning Hwan to the estate was a death sentence? Kwan-ho's eyes shifted. He was a man built on intuition, a man who had survived 1,000 betrayals by reading the air. He looked at Min-jae, then back at me. My son, he whispered. Bring him to me. Now. Not until you clear the perimeter, I demanded. Only you. No guns. No loyal shadows. The guards bristled, but Kwan-ho raised a hand. With a sharp flick of his wrist, the red dots vanished. The wall of men stepped back into the darkness. Min-jae's face went pale, the mask finally cracking. He knew that once Hwan spoke, the game was over. I led the boss into the skeletal remains of the textile mill. The climb was slow, the man's expensive shoes struggled with the rusted rungs, but his focus was absolute. When we finally reached the clock loft, the sight was heartbreaking. Hwan was curled in a ball, his breathing shallow, the burlap sacks his only protection against the world. Kwan-ho choked out, the iron boss vanishing, replaced by a father. As he knelt by the boy, I felt a presence behind us. I turned just as Min-jae reached the top of the ladder, a hidden blade gleaming in the dim light of the clock face. He wasn't going for the boss. He was going for the witness. The blade flashed in the dim, amber light of the clock tower, a silver streak aimed at the boy who held the truth. Min-jae was desperate, he knew that the moment Hwan woke up, his empire of lies would crumble. But he had forgotten one thing, this tower was my territory. I knew every loose floorboard, every rusted gear, and every treacherous shadow. As Min-jae lunged, I didn't try to fight him. I kicked the heavy brass counterweight of the frozen clock mechanism. With a deafening groan of protesting metal, the massive gear spun, catching the sleeve of Min-jae's designer suit and jerking him off balance. He stumbled, the blade clattering harmlessly onto the floor. At that moment, Hwan's eyes fluttered open. The fever hadn't taken his memory. He looked at the man struggling with the gears, then at the man kneeling beside him. Father, he croaked, his small hand reaching out. Then, his finger pointed toward Min-jae. He told the men to take me. He said I was going to a surprise party. But there was no party. Just the dark. The air in the room turned arctic. Kwan-ho stood up slowly, his shadow stretching across the Roman numerals of the clock face like an ancient god of vengeance. He didn't scream. He didn't even draw a weapon. He simply looked at Min-jae with a terrifying, quiet clarity. A surprise party, Kwan-ho repeated, his voice a low, vibrating hum. You used my son's innocence to bury him. Min-jae's bravado vanished. He fell to his knees, pleading, but the boss had already turned his back. 2 silent men in black suits appeared at the top of the ladder, and within seconds, the traitor was removed from the tower. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a debt that could never fully be repaid. Kwan-ho turned to me. He looked at my torn hoodie, my dirt-streaked face, and the medicine bottles I was still clutching like a lifeline. He reached out, not to seize me, but to take the medicine. You saved the only thing that matters to me, he said. The city calls you a ghost, but tonight, you were the only thing that was real. A week later, I stood on the balcony of a penthouse that overlooked the very slums where I used to scavenge for scraps. I was wearing clean clothes, my skin was warm, and the hunger that had been my constant companion for 3 years was finally gone. Hwan sat nearby, recovering and safe, watching a cartoon on a screen larger than my old crawlspace. He looked up and smiled, a real, bright smile that made every bruise and every narrow escape worth it. Mr. Kwan-ho stepped out onto the balcony, handing me a small, black envelope. You said you wanted security and a sense of belonging, he said. The estate is yours. You are Hwan's guardian now. No one will ever look past you again. I looked out at the city lights. I was no longer a shadow. I was the protector of the air, the girl who had walked into the lion's den and come out with a family. I realized then that my invisibility hadn't been a curse, it had been the training ground for the woman I was meant to become. the girl of shadows was dead. And in her place, a queen of the underworld's heart had been born. Thank you so much for watching this journey. If you were moved by Xylia's courage and the bond she formed with Juan, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of unlikely heroes and hidden truths. Now, I want to hear from you. If you were in Xylia's shoes, would you have risked your life for a stranger, or would you have stayed hidden in the shadows? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one, and your support helps us keep these stories alive. Until next time, stay curious and stay kind.